Human will is not a fortified castle to be besieged with violence. It is a building with hidden doors, poorly closed windows, foundations that can be undermined without the inhabitant perceiving the collapse until it is too late. The destruction of the will is an ancient art, practiced with mastery in the temples of Mesopotamia, in the Roman legions, in medieval dungeons, in every power structure that understood a fundamental truth. Breaking a human being by force is less effective than making that human being break themselves. Mind control is not external invasion. It is infiltration. It is not conquest. It is seduction towards surrender. The most devastating tactics are those that transform the subject into an active accomplice of their own destruction, where the cage is built from within and the prisoner thanks for the bars because they have taught him to call them protection. Ancient empires understood this with a clarity that still resonates in modern methods of domination. When Rome conquered a territory, it did not just knock down walls and capture soldiers. It executed a meticulous sequence of psychological operations designed to dismantle the collective identity of the defeated. First came the demonstration of absolute power, an initial massacre calculated not to eliminate the population, but to establish a terror parameter. Tens of thousands publicly executed, their bodies displayed as a living warning. But this was only the prologue. The true destruction of willpower began afterward, when the survivors were forced to participate in the construction of their own prison. The conquered peoples had to build the Roman roads that would facilitate future invasions, the aqueducts that would make the permanent occupation more comfortable, the amphitheaters where they would witness their own humiliation turned into spectacle. Every stone laid was an act of internalized self-defeat. Every completed structure was physical evidence that they had accepted their new role, that their resistance had been not only defeated, but transformed into productive collaboration. This transformation of resistance into collaboration operated through a psychological mechanism that the Romans intuitively mastered: the gradual erosion of the previous identity. They did not immediately prohibit local customs. They allowed them, but surrounded them with incremental restrictions. Native gods could be worshipped as long as Roman gods were also acknowledged. Local languages could be spoken, but only Latin had legal validity. Traditional clothing could be worn, but those dressed in Roman style received preferential treatment. The conquered never faced an absolute prohibition that justified heroic resistance, only an endless series of small concessions that seemed reasonable in isolation, but cumulatively dismantled the entire framework of their previous identity. Each concession set a precedent for the next. Each adaptation reduced the psychological territory from which to resist. The conqueror did not destroy the will with a blow. He bled it out with 1,000 invisible cuts until the subject no longer remembered what they were originally defending. The priests of ancient temples perfected complementary control techniques that operated in the spiritual realm. They knew that willpower is based on the sense of personal agency, on the belief that our actions can modify our destiny. To destroy that will, it was necessary to destroy that belief. Religious rituals were meticulously designed to generate states of learned helplessness. A peasant, bringing his best offerings to the temple, praying for rain, would witness the priest declare that the gods were dissatisfied, that more offerings, sacrifices, and devotion were required. If the rain arrived, it was due to divine benevolence. If it did not, it was due to the devotee's insufficiency. The system was hermetic, infallible, designed so that the individual could never establish a causal relationship between their actions and the results. The will is nourished by feedback, by the experience that effort produces change. When that bond is systematically broken, when effort never yields predictable results, the will withers like unused muscle. The individual learns that their actions are irrelevant, that incomprehensible external forces determine their fate, and that understanding is the fertile ground where total submission germinates. This technique of disconnection between action and result was employed with scientific brutality in ancient slavery systems. A slave on Egyptian plantations or in Roman mines existed in a universe where personal effort was completely divorced from personal reward. Working more did not improve their condition. Demonstrating exceptional skill did not guarantee preferential treatment. Perfect obedience did not ensure avoiding punishment. The masters randomly varied their satisfaction criteria. One day they punished slowness, the next day they punished haste. One day they rewarded initiative, the next they penalized it as insubordination. This arbitrariness was not caprice. It was control technology. It generated a psychological state where the slave understood that their will, their decisions, their efforts were fundamentally irrelevant in determining their experience. And when a human being internalizes that irrelevance of their own will, they stop exercising it. They become a passive reactor, an object waiting for external instructions because they have learned that any personal initiative is statistically irrelevant or counterproductive. The interrogators of antiquity developed entire repertoires of techniques based on this principle of disintegration of personal agency. Physical torture was useful but limited. The body has finite pain thresholds. Psychological torture, properly applied, lacked limits because it operated in the infinite territory of hope and meaning. A prisoner could be kept in almost total isolation, but with a carefully calibrated element of human contact. Once a day, a guard would enter, offer food, ask a seemingly trivial question about their past life, and leave without violence. This continued for weeks. The prisoner, desperate for human connection, would begin to anticipate that visit, mentally prepare their responses, and look for signs of empathy or recognition in the guard's expressions. And then, without explanation, the visits would cease. The prisoner remained in total darkness, unsure if he had done something wrong, if the guard had been punished for showing humanity, if this was the prelude to his execution, or simply another link in an infinite chain of manipulations. Uncertainty was the weapon. The inability to predict or influence was the mechanism of destruction. Each cycle of thwarted hope eroded a little more the subject's ability to maintain a coherent narrative about his reality. And without a coherent narrative, willpower dissolves into a soup of fragmented reactions. This fragmentation of personal narrative was also the core of the indoctrination techniques used in ancient cults and sects. The mysteries of Eleusis, the Dionysian cults, the mysteric religions that proliferated in the Greco-Roman world, all employed ritual sequences designed to temporarily dismantle the initiate's sense of identity. The process began with prolonged sensory deprivation, fasting, vigils that pushed the subject into altered states of consciousness. Then came carefully orchestrated experiences of terror and ecstasy, incomprehensible symbols presented as sacred revelations, contradictory narratives that had to be accepted simultaneously. The initiate was pushed into a state where their previous frames of reference no longer worked, where everything they had considered real seemed like illusion, and where the illusions presented by the cult appeared as deeper realities. In that state of maximum cognitive vulnerability, new narratives, new loyalties, and new definitions of identity were implanted. The individual left the process convinced that they had experienced a sacred transformation, when in reality, they had been a victim of reprogramming technology that systematically exploited the vulnerabilities of the human psyche under extreme stress. The Spartan military strategists applied variations of these techniques in their own training system, the agoge. The Spartan boys were taken from their families at the age of 7 and subjected to a regime of calculated brutality that lasted more than a decade. Perpetual hunger, constant violence, ritual humiliation, all calibrated not to physically strengthen them, but to destroy any vestige of individuality and rebuild them as extensions of the state's will. A particularly sinister component of the system was the cryptia, where young Spartans were sent to hunt and kill Helot slaves as an initiation rite. This not only trained combat skills, but also implanted a fundamental psychological equation: that personal valor was measured by the ability to destroy others without remorse, that empathy was weakness, and that the only legitimate will was the will of the Spartan collective. A child who survived this process had not strengthened his will. His individual will had been completely replaced by an external imperative that he now experienced as his own. The final product was a soldier who could not conceive of existence outside the Spartan military machine, not because he was cowardly to desert, but because desertion was literally unthinkable within the cognitive framework that had been implanted in him. This implementation of cognitive frameworks reached extraordinary levels of sophistication in the imperial courts of China and Persia. The systems of eunuchs who managed the harem and imperial bureaucracies were case studies in how physical mutilation could be used as an anchor for complete psychological reconstruction. A castrated man not only lost reproductive capacity, but also lost his position in the patriarchal social structure that defined male value. He could no longer be a father, ancestor, or lineage transmitter. His biological existence was cut off from the temporal flow that connects past and future. In that void, the imperial system implanted a new identity, a perpetual servant whose only continuity was loyalty to the institution that had mutilated him. The most successful eunuchs, those who reached positions of immense power, were living testimonies of the perfect perversion of the control mechanism. Victims who fiercely defended the system that had victimized them because their entire identity now depended on that system. Without it, they were simply broken men. Within it, they were administrators of empires. The system had taken everything from them and then given them something back. And that something, as miserable as it was compared to what was lost, was now all they had. The medieval inquisitors refined these control techniques until they became documented procedures, manuals for the systematic destruction of the will. The Malleus Maleficarum was not just a treatise on witchcraft, it was a manual of psychological engineering. It precisely described how to isolate the accused, how to deprive her of sleep through interrogations lasting days, how to employ social pressure by having her own community testify against her, how to offer her escape through confession only to move the goalposts immediately after each confession. The accused was not simply subjected to physical torture. She faced the progressive disintegration of her reality. First, her community was taken away. Then, her reputation, then her physical freedom, and finally, her sanity. At each stage, an exit was offered: confess. But confessing meant validating the system that was destroying her. It meant accepting that she was truly a witch, that she deserved her punishment, that her torturers were agents of justice. The Inquisition did not seek the truth, it sought performance. It needed the victim to actively participate in her own condemnation, because that participation legitimized the entire apparatus of terror. This need for the active participation of the victim revealed something fundamental about the nature of mind control, that it is more effective when voluntary. The most efficient slave systems were not those that employed more violence, but those that cultivated slaves who identified with their condition. In India's caste system, an untouchable who internalized their ritual impurity was infinitely more manageable than one who recognized the system as an arbitrary social construct. The convinced untouchable of their own contamination not only accepted their oppression, but imposed it on themselves more rigorously than any external authority. They excluded themselves from spaces, limited their opportunities, and punished other untouchables who violated the norms. The caste system had achieved the ultimate triumph of control, making the victim become the guardian of their own cage, internalizing external restrictions so completely that physical guards were no longer necessary. The prison had become psychological, invisible, perfect. European feudal systems operated with a similar logic, but with different mechanics. A serf bound to the land was not enslaved in the Roman sense. He could have a family, limited property, and some daily autonomy. But that appearance of freedom was precisely what made the control more insidious. The serf could choose how to cultivate his plot, but the plot belonged to the Lord. He could marry, but he needed the Lord's permission. He could have children, but those children inherited his serf status. Every choice he made was framed within parameters set by the feudal system. He lived in the illusion of agency because he made decisions constantly, but all those decisions operated within a cage whose dimensions he could never question. The genius of the feudal system was that the serf experienced his lack of freedom not as an external imposition, but as a natural reality. He did not wonder why he should serve the Lord any more than he wondered why the sun rose in the east. The most effective control is the one that becomes invisible when it is naturalized, when it is incorporated into the very fabric of what the subject considers real and possible. This naturalization of control required institutions that operated constantly, reproducing and reinforcing the narratives of domination. The medieval church fulfilled this function with industrial efficiency. Every Mass was a reiteration of the hierarchical order: God over Christ, Christ over the Pope over kings, kings over nobles, nobles over servants. This order was not presented as a human construction, but as a reflection of the unchangeable divine will. Questioning your position in the hierarchy was questioning God's design. It was a sin of pride that guaranteed eternal condemnation. The suffering servant was not being oppressed. He was atoning for sins, earning spiritual merit, ensuring his salvation. His suffering had meaning, purpose, cosmic justification. The church had achieved something that no purely secular system could attain. It had turned oppression into a path of redemption, had made the victim not only accept, but value their victimization as a spiritual opportunity. Mind control reached its most refined form when the victim not only obeyed, but also appreciated the opportunity to obey. The Mongols under Genghis Khan employed a different, yet equally devastating methodology. They did not seek to break the will through subtle manipulation, but through overwhelming demonstration of the futility of resistance. When besieging a city, they sent envoys offering generous terms of surrender, peaceful surrender, in exchange for incorporation into the Mongol Empire with considerable autonomy. If the city resisted and was eventually conquered, the massacre was total, methodical, displayed. Men, women, children, all executed. The neighboring cities received detailed reports of the destruction. The message was crystal clear. Resisting is not only useless, it is collective suicide. Surrendering immediately is the only rational decision. This use of terror as a management tool for expectations destroyed the will to resist before the Mongol army arrived. The cities surrendered, not because the Mongols were militarily invincible, but because they had built a reputation that made resistance psychologically impossible. The enemy had already been defeated in their imagination. Physical combat was just a formality. This preventive destruction of the will through management of narratives was also central in the propaganda systems employed by ancient tyrants. Nero, Caligula, Domitian, all understood that absolute power requires not only military strength, but also control of the narrative. Public executions of dissidents were not just elimination of enemies, they were pedagogical theater. Each execution was accompanied by an official narrative that explained exactly why the executed deserved their fate. Treason, heresy, conspiracy. The charges varied, but the pattern was constant. The state is benevolent, just, necessary, and only those who betray that order deserve punishment. The population observed and learned the lesson that dissent is not only dangerous, but illegitimate. That the suffering of dissidents is not tragedy, but justice. The tyrant did not need to break the will of each individual citizen. He only needed to create an environment where the will to resist withered due to lack of social oxygen, where no one dared to express discontent because doing so would mark them as a legitimate traitor. The slave traders operating on the trans-Saharan and transatlantic routes developed specific protocols to break the will of the captives during transport. The Middle Passage was not just a geographical journey, it was a psychological process of systematic demolition of identity. The slaves were chained together, but separated from anyone who shared their language, their tribe, their cultural reference system. They could not communicate, could not organize, and could not even console each other in their own language. This forced communication breakdown reduced them to isolated units of suffering. Then came the trauma of the voyage itself. Weeks in inhumane conditions where death was so common that survivors developed a form of psychological numbness, a necessary dissociation to maintain sanity. Upon arrival at their destination, they had been stripped of everything: family, community, language, culture, name. They were blank pages on which the slave system could write new identities, new purposes, new loyalties. The effective slave was not the one recently captured, but the one who had gone through this process of erasure and rewriting. The one who no longer clearly remembered who they had been before the capture, or who remembered but experienced that past as belonging to someone else, someone who had died during the journey. Modern totalitarian systems simply industrialized and systematized these ancient techniques. Communist re-education camps operated with the same logic as forced religious conversions of previous centuries. The subject was isolated, subjected to endless self-criticism sessions where they had to identify and denounce their own incorrect thoughts, rewarded when they demonstrated genuine acceptance of the state ideology, and punished when they showed resistance. But the punishment was not only physical, it was social. Cellmates who had advanced further in their re-education participated in criticism sessions, pointed out insincerities, and identified hidden resistances. The system created a perverse competition where demonstrating ideological orthodoxy required betraying others, and each betrayal was simultaneously a treason to comrades and a proof of loyalty to the system. The subject was forced to constantly choose between solidarity and survival, and each survival choice eroded a little more his ability to see himself as an integral person. The goal was not to create sincere believers in the ideology. That was impossible and also unnecessary. The goal was to create individuals so internally fragmented, so burdened with guilt for their own betrayals, that future dissent was psychologically inaccessible because it would first require reconstructing a sense of personal integrity that the process had systematically demolished. The interrogation techniques developed by intelligence services during the Cold War refined these methods to levels of scientific precision. The CIA manuals on interrogation, later declassified, read like updates of medieval inquisitorial manuals. Sensory deprivation, to destabilize the subject's sense of reality. Manipulation of the environment to create constant uncertainty about what is real and what is fabricated. Unpredictable alternation between kindness and hostility to prevent the subject from developing coherent resistance strategies. False revelations about traitorous allies to induce paranoia and psychological isolation. The interrogator does not primarily seek information, they seek dependence. They want the subject to reach a state where the interrogator is the only source of stability in a universe that has become completely chaotic. When the subject reaches that state, when they start seeking approval from the interrogator, when they begin to rationalize cooperation as a way to restore some sense of order, then the will has indeed been destroyed. The subject is no longer being broken. They are breaking themselves and seeking validation from the interrogator that they are doing the right thing. This search for validation from the oppressor is perhaps the clearest indicator that the destruction of the will has been completed. When the victim of domestic abuse begins to excuse their abuser, justify the violence as something they provoked, defend the abuser from external criticism, they have reached a state of psychological captivity that transcends any physical restraint. They may have the door open, resources to escape, willing people to help, and yet they remain because their will to leave has been systematically destroyed through cycles of violence followed by reconciliation, degradation followed by moments of false intimacy, terror followed by relief that they interpret as love. The abuser has achieved what no physical chain could. They have made the victim build their identity around the abusive relationship, interpret their presence in that relationship not as imprisonment, but as choice, as commitment, even as love. The will has not been broken through an act of catastrophic violence, but through the cumulative erosion of the individual's ability to imagine alternative existence. Educational systems, in their most corrupt form, operate with similar principles. They do not educate, they indoctrinate. They do not cultivate critical thinking, they cultivate reflective obedience. The student quickly learns that the correct questions are those whose answers the teacher already knows, that creativity is only valuable within established parameters, that intellectual rebellion will be punished with poor grades that jeopardize the entire future. Years of this conditioning produce adults who experience their own conformity, not as surrender, but as maturity, as realism, as intelligent adaptation to the rules of the game. They have lost access to the part of themselves that once questioned, that imagined alternatives, that resisted. That part was not dramatically murdered. It was gradually put to sleep through a million small corrections, subtle reprimands, social signals, indicating that certain ways of thinking were childish, illusory, inappropriate. The educational system, when it functions as a control mechanism rather than a liberating one, destroys the will by making it unnecessary, creating subjects who self-regulate, who have internalized external restrictions so completely that they no longer experience them as restrictions, but as common sense. This internalization of oppression as common sense is the final stage of the destruction of will. When the subject can no longer distinguish between their own desires and the desires that have been implanted in them, when they defend their prison as if it were their home, when they attack those who point out the bars because such signaling threatens the narrative they have built to make their captivity bearable, then the oppressor's work is complete. They no longer need guards. The prisoner guards themselves. They no longer need propaganda. The prisoner voluntarily reproduces the system's messages. They no longer need violence. The prisoner directs any necessary violence towards themselves or other prisoners who threaten the collective stability of denial. The veterans of ancient wars, those who survived decades of military campaigns, developed a particular form of this destruction of will. They had seen so much death, executed so many atrocious orders, participated in so many massacres, that they could no longer sustain any narrative of heroism or justice. They knew that war was simply organized slaughter, that flags and gods were just decoration over a core of senseless violence. But they also could not fully admit this, because doing so would invalidate their entire lives, turning every act they had performed into an unjustifiable crime. So they existed in a state of double consciousness, knowing and not knowing simultaneously, aware of reality but unable to act based on that awareness. Their will had not been broken by an event, but by the impossible accumulation of experiences that could not be integrated into any coherent narrative of meaning. They became functional automatons, obeying orders because the alternative was to confront the total emptiness of meaning that their lives represented. Past psychiatric institutions employed control techniques that reflected and amplified these dynamics. A patient interned in a 19th century madhouse entered a system supposedly designed to heal, but which frequently operated as a laboratory for destroying willpower. They took away his name, assigned him a number. They stripped him of his clothes, gave him an institutional uniform. They took away his time. Every moment of the day was regulated by bells and orders. They took away his privacy. Every action was observed and recorded. And then, when the patient showed signs of resistance to this regime, when he rebelled or expressed distress, that same resistance was classified as a symptom of his illness, as proof that he needed more treatment, more control, more destruction of his recalcitrant will. The system was perfectly circular. Resistance to the system proved the system's necessity. The patient who finally accepted his diagnosis, who behaved obediently, who no longer questioned the doctor's decisions, was declared improved and eventually released, not because he had healed, but because his will had been sufficiently destroyed so that he no longer posed an administrative problem. This circular logic virtually infected all social control institutions. Criminals in prison systems learned that showing genuine remorse was not enough. They had to show the right kind of remorse, formulated in the right language, expressed at the right moments. Rehabilitation did not mean genuine transformation, but convincing performance of transformation. The prisoner who mastered this performance gained parole. Those who insisted on their innocence or expressed remorse in an apparently inappropriate manner remained locked up. The system punished not so much the crime as it punished resistance to the official narrative of crime and rehabilitation. The prisoner learned that his will, perceptions, and version of events were irrelevant. Only the institutional version mattered, and its survival depended on the prisoner's ability to act it convincingly, even if he did not believe it. With enough time, the distinction between acting and believing dissolved. The prisoner forgot where the mask ended, and his true face began. His will had not been broken through torture, but through the constant necessity to falsify himself until the false became the only accessible reality. Well, all these techniques, all these systems, all these institutions of domination have something in common beyond their specific methods. They all work because they exploit fundamental characteristics of the human psyche: our need for coherent narrative, our dependence on social validation, our vulnerability to isolation, our tendency to rationalize the irrational when the alternative is total psychological collapse. Ancient mind control tactics are not historical relics that we study with academic curiosity from the safety of the enlightened present. They are templates that continue to operate, refined and updated, in every structure where power differences exist. The question is not whether these tactics existed in antiquity. The question is, which of these tactics are being applied to you right now? At what point was your will replaced by a convincing imitation of will that can only operate within parameters set by others? When did you learn to call your cage freedom because the bars are invisible? Which version of yourself have you had to falsify for so long that you no longer remember what you were falsifying? And the most disturbing question, how many times have you applied these tactics yourself, consciously or unconsciously, to those who have less power than you, perpetuating the same control mechanisms whose victims you pretend not to be? Because the destruction of the will is not just something others do to us. It is something we learn to do, replicate, normalize, defend, until the cycle becomes so natural that we forget it was once violence and start calling it simply life.